It is Monday, the 3rd of March, 2025, and I'm going to kick it right off. United Nations Live, UN Rights Chief gives international update. And enjoy. It's very important. I highly recommend people watch this. It's a long video, but very important.
And item 2, I have the honour to greet Mr. Volker Turk, High Commissioner for Human Rights. High Commissioner, you have the floor.
Monsieur le Président,
President.
Our world is going through a period of turbulence and unpredictability reflected in growing conflict and divided societies. The international community has come through many setbacks and periods of geopolitical turmoil since the founding of the United Nations. But what we are experiencing goes to the very core of the international order, an order that has brought us an unprecedented level of global stability. We cannot allow the fundamental global consensus around international norms and institutions built painstakingly over decades to crumble before our eyes. I'm here to sound the alarm. According to the International Committee of the Red Cross, 120 conflicts rage around the world. War is the ultimate violation of human rights. It is outrageous that across these conflicts, the legal frameworks designed to safeguard civilians, limit damage, and ensure justice are dismissed and discarded blatantly and repeatedly. Civilians are deliberately attacked. Sexual violence and famine are used as weapons of war. Humanitarian access is denied, while weapons flow across borders and circumvent international sanctions. And humanitarian workers are targeted. In 2024, a record 356 humanitarian workers were killed while providing aid to people in some of the world's most appalling crises. Mr. President, conflict is a chaos machine. As I briefed last week, the conflict in Sudan threatens to explode across the region. Parties to the conflict and their allies continue to launch devastating attacks on densely populated areas and civilian infrastructure with total impunity, as the worst humanitarian catastrophe deepens. Civilians are paying an unbearable price in a naked struggle for power and resources. All countries must use their influence to apply pressure on the parties and their allies to stop the war, embark on an inclusive dialogue, and transition to a civilian-led government. In Ukraine, 3 years since the full-scale Russian invasion, people continue to suffer appallingly. Civilian casualties rose by 30% between 2023 and 2024. Russia's armed forces have systematically targeted Ukraine's energy infrastructure with coordinated strikes, severely reducing the electricity capacity and causing widespread disruption to essential services. Relentless attacks with aerial glide bombs, long-range missiles, and drones have placed civilians in a state of constant insecurity and fear. In occupied territory, the Russian Federation continues to restrict Ukrainians' fundamental rights and freedoms severely. I'm dismayed by continued reports of summary executions and the widespread and systematic torture of Ukrainian prisoners of war by Russian forces. This situation is dire. Any discussions about ending the war must include Ukrainians and fully respect their human rights. Sustainable peace must be based on the United Nations Charter and international law. In Gaza, Israel's means and methods of warfare in response to the horrific attacks by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups on 7 October 2023 have razed the territory and shredded the social and physical fabric. We must above all make sure the fragile ceasefire in Gaza holds and becomes the basis for peace. Any solution to the cycles of violence must be rooted in human rights, including the right to self-determination, the rule of law and accountability. All hostages must be freed, all those detained arbitrarily must be released, and humanitarian aid into Gaza must resume immediately. In the West Bank, I'm alarmed by the use of military weapons and tactics, including tanks and airstrikes against Palestinians, the destruction and emptying of refugee camps, the expansion of illegal settlements, the severe restrictions on movement, and the displacements of tens of thousands of people. Israel's unilateral actions and threats of annexation in the West Bank, in violation of international law, must stop. The recent escalation in Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo is now drawing in regional players and devastating entire communities in North and South Kivu. In the past 5 weeks, thousands of people have reportedly been killed during attacks by the M23 armed group backed by the Rwandan armed forces in intense fighting against the armed forces of the DRC and their allies. There are horrifying reports of rape, sexual slavery, and summary executions. More than 500,000 people have been forced to flee this year, adding to almost 7.8 million people already displaced in the country. The violence must stop. Violations by all parties must be investigated, and dialogue must resume. In Myanmar, 2024 was the deadliest year for civilians since the military coup 4 years ago. The military ramped up brutal attacks on civilians as their grip on power eroded, with retaliatory airstrikes and artillery shelling of villages and urban areas, arbitrary arrests and prosecutions, and the forcible conscription of thousands of young people. I urge the international community to cut decisively the supply of arms and finance that enable the military's vicious repression. In Haiti, gang violence spiraled out of control last year. More than 5,600 people were killed and thousands more were injured or kidnapped. Deep economic and social inequalities have been exacerbated by violence, including sexual violence and violence against children. Over 1 million people are internally displaced, half of them children. Full implementation of the Security Council's arms embargo and support to the multinational security support mission are crucial to resolving this crisis. Hostilities in and around Yemen continue with an alarming impact on the human rights and humanitarian situation. Almost 20 million Yemenis need humanitarian support. I'm outraged by the death of a World Food Programme colleague in detention earlier this month. All 23 UN staff, including 8 colleagues from my own office, who are arbitrarily detained by the Houthis, must be released immediately. Mr. President, conflict causes chaos, but it arises from its own twisted logic. Some people, autocrats, demagogues, profiteers, benefit from that chaos, whether through divide and rule tactics, predatory business practices, or simple theft. Conflict bleeds into all our lives, from the products we buy to the news feeds we scroll, from minerals mined in war zones to the so-called bot farms and scam centers that flourish in the most lawless corners of the world. We're all somewhat implicated, and we all have a responsibility to act through our consumption habits, our social media use, and our political and social engagement. Accountability is key, making sure perpetrators of abuses and violations are held to account for their crimes. We can trace a clear line between the lack of accountability for airstrikes on hospitals in Syria in the 2010s, attacks on healthcare facilities in Yemen, and the destruction of health systems in Gaza and Sudan. According to one study, 2023 was the deadliest year for healthcare workers in a decade. Some 480 were killed during armed conflict, nearly double the previous year. Accountability remedies the past and protects the future. Last month, for example, a Swedish court convicted an ISIS-affiliated woman of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes against the Yazidis in 2015. A court in Mexico recently upheld the conviction of 5 military officers for the extrajudicial executions of university students in 2010. And ongoing investigations by the International Criminal Court into various situations create hope of justice for victims everywhere. Around the world, civil society, lawyers, and victims are calling on warring parties to respect international law and pursue avenues of accountability. States need to be put on notice that the world is watching, including on arms transfers to conflict zones. Beyond states, corporations must also be held to account, including for damage to our climate and our environment. In December, for example, the Supreme Court of Kenya reaffirmed a landmark decision awarding compensation for deaths caused by lead poisoning. I'm also encouraged by a growing wave of litigation that seeks to hold fossil fuel companies to account for climate-related damage. But these cases are the exception rather than the rule. In this connection, I urge the European Union to maintain robust human rights and environmental due diligence at the heart of their corporate sustainability laws as they consider reforms. Mr. President, an absence of accountability leads directly to an absence of peace. And yet, a tireless search for peace is what the world needs most. Preemptive strikes cannot replace preventive diplomacy. Today, wars are lasting longer and peace negotiations are less successful. According to one study, the number of conflicts that ended through peace agreements fell from 23% in the 1970s to 4% in the 2010s. For millions of people around the world, war has become a simple, devastating fact of life. This should shake us all. We need to build peace from the ground up, to grasp it, nurture it, protect it, and promote it at every opportunity. Bring warring parties to the table, ensure that women are involved from beginning to end, build peace around human rights. Transitional justice seeks to do exactly that. It helps fractured societies to heal, reconcile, and rebuild. We see its impact all over the world. In Liberia, my office's support has played an important part in advancing transitional justice and promoting accountability. Establishing the Office of the War and Economic Crimes Court last May, was a significant step towards justice for victims of the civil wars between 1989 and 2003. In Colombia, we are reminded of the importance of the participation of civil society in peace-building efforts, notably women, Afro-descendants, and indigenous peoples. Peace requires constant vigilance as part of a sustained, victim-centered transitional justice process. The design and implementation of Ethiopia's transitional justice process will be key to demonstrating its ability to address past violations. This is a fragile moment. The human rights situation continued to be dire in 2024, notably in the Amhara and Oromia regions. The situation in Tigray has improved since the cessation of hostilities agreement, but tensions remain high. Worryingly, civic space has become more restricted throughout the country. Proposed amendments to the media law put the rights to freedom of expression, association, and peaceful assembly at risk. None of these steps are conducive to sustainable peace. The Western Balkans are an example of transitional justice delayed. Almost 30 years after the end of the conflict in Bosnia and Herzegovina, more progress on peace building, economic and social reforms, and the protection of human rights are badly needed. Across the whole region, leaders must abandon ethno-nationalist agendas and revisionist narratives that justify or deny atrocity crimes and glorify convicted war criminals. My office is working to get transitional justice back on track. I'm following closely the ongoing peace negotiations between Armenia and Azerbaijan in the hope that they will lead to a process of truth-telling, healing, and reconciliation. We stand ready to support. All those arbitrarily detained in Azerbaijan, including ethnic Armenians, must be released immediately, and fair trial rights must be respected fully. Bangladesh last year experienced a paroxysm of violence as the government of the time brutally suppressed a student movement that carried human rights at its torch. The country is now charting a new future. Our recent independent fact-finding report on the grave human rights violations that took place is an important contribution to this journey. I hope it will support truth-telling, accountability, reparations, healing, and reform. It will be crucial to ensure due process in criminal cases and investigate revenge violence, including against minorities. Syria is also at a critical turning point. My office, together with local and international organizations, raised the alarms and documented appalling human rights violations and abuses for over 14 years before the regime was ousted. This record can now support justice and truth-telling. The interim authorities are facing difficult challenges, and we are ready to accompany them moving forward. I am concerned by reports of revenge violence and abuses. The authorities have an opportunity now to deliver on Syrians' expectations, guided by the human rights of all Syrians, regardless of their gender, ethnicity, religion, and race. Women must play a full role in all transitional institutions and decisions. When I visited Lebanon earlier this year, I was encouraged by the commitment of the new leadership to human rights. The country now has a unique opportunity to embark on legal reforms and address deep inequalities and other social and economic issues. These will be crucial to restore social cohesion, build public confidence in state institutions, and deliver on the aspirations of the Lebanese people. Mr. President, even in societies that are nominally at peace, people are feeling insecure and unmoored. Communities and societies struggle with polarization and division, which are anathema to human rights. I have followed recent election campaigns in Europe, North America, and beyond with increasing trepidation. Single-issue sound bites, devoid of substance, oversimplify complex issues, and are often based on scapegoating, disinformation, and dehumanization. Migration, for example, is an age-old phenomenon that can be addressed to everyone's benefit. Refugees fleeing persecution are entitled to live in safety, free from harassment. And yet, migrants and refugees are widely labeled as illegals, criminals, vermin, or worse. We have heard these terms before. Excessive use of force and deaths of people of African descent at the hands of law enforcement officials persist, often rooted in systemic racism. Other communities face deep-seated, caste-based discrimination related to work and descent. LGBTIQ+ people, particularly transgender people, continue to face high levels of violence, harassment, and discrimination in all regions of the world. People with disabilities face discrimination, bias, and stigma every day. Dehumanization is a well-worn step towards treating an entire group as outsiders, unworthy of the basic rights we all enjoy. It is a dangerous precursor to hate and violence and must be called out whenever it occurs. Mr. President, from autocracies to democracies, women and girls are denied their rights in myriad ways. In Afghanistan, women and girls are subject to state-sponsored gender apartheid that is unparalleled in today's world. Virtual prisoners within their homes, they are denied the most basic and fundamental freedoms essential to normal life, including movement, education, and work. I'm deeply concerned for the long-term future of a country that is self-harming on a national scale. In Iran, the hijab law has been temporarily suspended, and I call again on the authorities to repeal the law fully and permanently, along with all other laws and practices that discriminate against women and girls. I also urge them to release all human rights defenders from detention and to end arbitrary arrests and imprisonment. I'm deeply troubled by the marked increase in executions last year, to over 900 reported cases. I've urged the Iranian authorities to place an immediate moratorium on the use of the death penalty. More broadly, I'm concerned about the resurgence in some quarters of toxic ideas about masculinity and efforts to glorify gender stereotypes, especially among young men. It is shocking to me that misogynistic influencers have millions of followers on social media and are hailed as heroes in some quarters. Online and offline, these ideas are translating into a wider pushback against gender equality, as well as violence and hateful rhetoric against women, women human rights defenders, and women politicians. We see these trends across all regions, from Latin America and Africa to East Asia, Europe, North America, and beyond. In some cases, they are making their way into reforms to laws and policies and risk reversing hard-won gains on gender equality. While more than 60 countries and territories have liberalized their abortion laws over the past 30 years, we are now seeing attempted rollbacks in many countries. 40% of women globally live under restrictive abortion laws. As always, it is the most marginalized women who suffer most. Mr. President, we have enjoyed bipartisan support from the United States of America on human rights over many decades, thanks to the generosity and compassion of the American people. I'm now deeply worried by the fundamental shift in direction that is taking place domestically and internationally. In a paradoxical mirror image, policies intended to protect people from discrimination are now labeled as discriminatory. Progress is being rolled back on gender equality. Disinformation, intimidation, and threats, notably against journalists and public officials, risk undermining the work of independent media and the functioning of institutions. Divisive rhetoric is being used to distort, deceive, and polarize. This is generating fear and anxiety among many. On these issues and more, my office will continue building on our long history of constructive engagement. Mr. President, societies need certain ingredients to thrive: a free public square with space for open debate, free and independent media, an independent judiciary, and transparent and representative state institutions. But when I look around the world, I see a troubling picture. In Nicaragua, the recent constitutional reform significantly increases the concentration of power in the presidency and dismantles checks and balances. Fundamental rights are at risk of being further curtailed, including the elimination of the prohibition of torture. I urge the Nicaraguan authorities to return to a democratic path and pursue a meaningful and constructive dialogue to this end. In Venezuela, I noted the announcement that more than 1,000 people were released after being detained following the presidential elections. All those arbitrarily detained must be released immediately. Political negotiations between the different stakeholders are urgently needed to agree to a viable pathway forward. I call for all electoral processes to be transparent, inclusive, peaceful, and fully in line with international human rights standards. In Argentina, I am troubled by recent executive actions that bypass established procedures for Supreme Court appointments, which risk undermining the independence of the judiciary and the rule of law. I also have serious concerns about the effect of austerity policies on the growing number of people living in poverty. In Mozambique, I call for the impartial and independent investigation into human rights violations and abuses which took place in the post-election period. My office is ready to work together with the new government and civil society to advance respect and protection of human rights in the country, including to strengthen human rights compliance of security forces. We have received many reports about a continued crackdown in the Russian Federation on civil society and independent media under the guise of national security. Stringent laws have been adopted to stifle free expression, labeling critical voices as foreign agents or undesirable organizations. Many journalists and activists, including anti-war protesters, have faced harassment, arrest, or exile, resulting in the near elimination of any form of dissent within the country. In Belarus, severe limitations on freedom of expression, association, and assembly persist, and human rights activism has all but disappeared. I note the recent series of releases from detention and call on the authorities to free all those who remain arbitrarily detained. While China is engaging with the international human rights system, I refer back to my previous updates, raising serious concerns and hope to see meaningful progress on these issues. I continue to make representations on behalf of lawyers, human rights defenders, and citizen journalists who have been arbitrarily detained under vague criminal offenses. In Hong Kong SAR, the broad application of national security laws continues to stifle civic space. The recent report by the International Labour Organization experts on counter-terrorism measures and labour programs in the Xinjiang region reinforce our own grave concerns and the urgency of addressing our long-standing recommendations. I'm also concerned by the impact of education policies and continued restrictions on freedom of expression, religion, and belief in the Tibet Autonomous Region. I will take these issues forward in our ongoing engagement. In Thailand, I remain troubled by the dissolution of the Move Forward party last August and the legal cases being pursued against its leaders. This impacts people's right to participate in public affairs and political life. Given last week's deportation of ethnic Uyghurs, I also call on Thailand to respect the fundamental principle of non-refoulement. India's democracy and institutions have been its greatest strength, underpinning its diversity and development. Democracy requires constant nurturing of participation and inclusion at all levels of society. I am concerned by the use of restrictive laws and harassment against human rights defenders and independent journalists, resulting in arbitrary detention and a diminished civic space, including in Kashmir. I also call for stepped-up efforts to address violence and displacement in Manipur based on dialogue, peace-building, and human rights. Civic space is shrinking in Egypt, where the authorities are using anti-terrorism legislation against those expressing dissent, including human rights defenders, journalists, bloggers, and peaceful demonstrators. These practices are creating fear, silencing critical voices, and hindering participation of human rights defenders in international human rights processes. I reiterate my call for the release of all those detained for exercising their human rights. We are seeing similar trends in other countries, including Algeria and Tunisia. Mr. President, on a more general note, I'm particularly concerned by the growing phenomenon of targeting journalists, human rights defenders, and political dissidents across borders using technology to track them. This insidious practice is used to intimidate, threaten, silence, detain, forcibly disappear, and even kill opponents and critics. It sends a clear message that no place is safe and living in a constant state of fear. Globally, the number of direct physical incidents of transnational repression has been rising since 2020, with egregious examples from around the world. We have observed in particular a pattern of abductions, disappearances, in some cases killings in mainland Southeast Asia. I urge all states to adopt a zero-tolerance policy toward extra legal transfers, renditions, and abductions, and to ensure full accountability for these violations, as well as respect for the principle of non-refoulement. Mr. President, today's massive shifts and profound transformations have left people in many countries around the world feeling alienated and abandoned. They believe their grievances and fears for the future are not taken seriously. As a result, they have lost trust in political leadership and institutions, which leads to more fragmentation. My response is, your concerns are our concerns, because they are about human rights, to education, to health, to housing, to free speech and access to justice. Human rights are about people's daily concerns for their families and their future. They are also about equity, global solidarity, and sustainable development. Human rights can never be played off against each other. They reinforce each other and reveal how we are all connected. The solution to today's pervasive unease lies in more respect for human rights, not less. It lies in uniting around more effective and efficient multilateral institutions and frameworks that protect us all. I am deeply troubled by efforts from a number of countries to undermine and inhibit the functioning of international legal frameworks and institutions, including the International Criminal Court, which is a fundamental pillar of international criminal justice. I'm stunned by the ease with which various international institutions are cast aside with measures that hinder the vital work they and their staff carry out. Mr. President, economic systems must deliver on economic, social, cultural, civil and political rights, the right to development, and the right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment. The Paris Agreement is an essential tool. We need a laser focus on stopping the climate crisis in its tracks and protecting those already feeling the heat. The World Health Organization plays an essential role in preventing pandemics and safeguarding people's well-being. Sweeping cuts to domestic social safety nets, climate finance, and foreign aid signal a massive setback for human rights protection, for conflict prevention, and for global stability. Social security, humanitarian and development aid, climate finance, and national security are not in opposition. They are mutually reinforcing. Mr. President, today, power dynamics are changing. Individuals and corporations have never had so much control and influence over our lives. A handful of unelected tech oligarchs have our data. They know where we live, what we do, our genes and our health conditions, our thoughts, our habits, our desires, and our fears. They know us better than we know ourselves, and they know how to manipulate us. Any form of unregulated power can lead to oppression, subjugation, and even tyranny, the playbook of the autocrat. We must adapt fast. States must fulfill their duty to protect people from unchecked power and work together to achieve this. Mr. President, in response to all the challenges I've outlined, we need to bring back the value of science, knowledge, and facts. And we need a clear, unequivocal commitment to the rule of law, to transparency, to independent institutions, all anchored in human rights. We also need a global coalition pushing for an alternative vision based on wisdom, justice, and compassion. Last week, I was struck how many leaders from all regions of the world are united around the cause of human rights. We must inspire with our values and demonstrate that human rights are a winning proposition for humanity. We must cherish the values of respect, unity, and solidarity, and work together for a safer, more just, more sustainable world. We can and will persevere. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Commissaire. Excellences, distingués collègues, nous allons maintenant reprendre le dialogue interactif sur la mise à jour orale du Haut-Commissaire sur la situation des droits de l'homme au Myanmar. Nous poursuivons la liste des orateurs et je donne la parole au distingué délégué de la Gambie. Gambia, you have the floor, please. Gambia. A microphone for the Gambia, please.
Good morning, Mr. President. Good morning, Mr. President. My delegation thanks the High Commissioner for the comprehensive update and aligns itself with the statement delivered on behalf of the OIC. The Gambian notes with deep concern the assessment of the deteriorating human rights situation in Myanmar, particularly regarding the plight of the Rohingya minority. We reiterate our call on the international community to intensify efforts to protect the Rohingya, ensure unimpeded humanitarian access, and facilitate their safe, dignified, and voluntary return to their homeland. Furthermore, we stress the urgent need for accountability for human rights violations. In this regard, we welcome the recent request by the Chief Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court for an arrest warrant against Myanmar's military leaders for crimes against humanity. The Gambia reaffirms its commitment to pursuing justice through the International Court of Justice and stands ready to collaborate with all stakeholders to restore peace and uphold human dignity in Myanmar. In conclusion, we ask, what specific measures would the Human Rights Council's office recommend to the international community to effectively protect the Rohingya population in Myanmar and hold perpetrators accountable? And I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Thailand.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thailand appreciates the High Commissioner's oral update. Thailand is deeply concerned over the ongoing violence and escalation of conflict in Myanmar. As an immediate neighbor, Thailand is committed to helping Myanmar to find peaceful solutions through meaningful engagement with all stakeholders. Last December, Thailand hosted 2 meetings related to the situation in Myanmar, namely the sixth country informal consultation, which was the first time that Myanmar and all its neighboring countries met to discuss issues of common concerns, and the extended informal consultation, where ASEAN member states discussed how to advance the implementation of the 5-point consensus. Thailand also continues to attach importance to providing humanitarian assistance to Myanmar. Throughout last year, we have contributed through ASEAN and various international organizations to alleviate the suffering of the people in Myanmar. As the number of people from Myanmar crossing over into Thailand continues to increase, Thailand will step up efforts to promote and protect the rights of these migrants. We have recently adopted the policy framework for humanitarian assistance along the Thai-Myanmar border in the areas of public health and education. We look forward to working with the international community and all stakeholders in this endeavor. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Vietnam.
Thank you, Mr. President. We take note of the High Commissioner's report on the human rights situation in Myanmar. Regarding the continued violence and humanitarian crisis in Myanmar, we urge all parties to exercise restraint, cease hostilities, and engage in meaningful dialogue. Vietnam expresses that the situation in Myanmar will soon stabilize so that its citizens can start rebuilding and developing the country and continue contributing to the creation of a united and strong ASEAN community. We also welcome the international...
I was just giving, I'll stop sharing for now. Oh, hi. Okay, right here. So I was busy. Apologies that my hair is not washed. Yeah, and so that's what it is. Present. Terrible lighting. Yeah, it's the UN. They call it the UN Rights Chief gives global update on crisis around the world. I call it gives international update, but it's just to show you that people within the UN have been screaming from the top of their lungs about the crimes against humanity that have been committed internationally, right? Even with people that are, and they're talking about Israel, they're talking about Palestine, they're talking about Ukraine and Russia, and yes, there are people on both sides of these conflicts, these proxy wars within Europe that have everything to gain, and exploiting people from within their own countries. And actually, maybe I will share a video from Redacted, because they nicely sum up a lot of stuff, right? Because I'm even having debates again with people on LinkedIn, and so other people that are like in the higher levels of government, even people that are working with NATO or with UN, like in Europe, and and they are still going full speed ahead. They, war, like go against Russia, all this stuff, no matter what it takes. But of course they're going to say that because they have it, like that's part of their jobs, right? Like whether they're working in government or with government, in like a consultant or advisory capacity. You're still lying and not understanding what's going on, despite the fact that you're on the ground. And I had a conversation with, and I shared this on my social media, and it's still there, but how I was explaining the things that were going on regarding a lot of the lies, the things that were instigated in order to get, for there to be a war kicked off and then further escalated on both sides or all sides, and now like more and more information is finally coming out. And now these people are saying that, that Trump is, like they're all going against Trump now, right? Because they're not understanding what, anyway. And again, I've even said that I don't agree with everything that Trump does or says. And there are concerns with some of the things he may push, like biodigital convergence stuff, and like there's possibly a fake and stage plan, alien invasion, like might get duped into one of those events, right? But and these people are saying like he's exploiting Ukraine, etc. And you know, that's not necessarily untrue. He's trying to get money back because he's a businessman, and that shouldn't surprise anyone. But we also have to point out that like all this money that people are saying is going to come from precious minerals from Ukraine right now, like these are areas that are inhabited or occupied by Russia, or that are Russian owned areas already that are not in dispute. And so upwards of 50 to 70% of what they're trying to say will come from Ukraine and trade with Ukraine is actually on Russian land. We got to look at that also, right? So again, there's a lot more smoke and mirrors, a lot of things that people need to address. And they're saying that he is trying to exploit the land. Look at BlackRock. Look at Larry Fink. Over 50% of Ukrainian farmland now is owned by them. And even after his meeting with JD Vance and Trump, he was literally in a room full of lobbyists. These warmongers like Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, BlackRock, the all of the, like the oil industry, like and the energy, like it's so obvious. And it's these people in these little committees and meetings and stuff like that they're the only ones benefiting from this. And but anyway, so that's where I was going with that. And so I don't know. There's more information coming out, and people's lives should be considered. So that's another thing too. Like there's a lot of people that are not aware that shareholders, like that people that work for shareholders, that are beholden to shareholders. This is even in law. If you look at the Dodge Ford case in the early 1900s, it's by law. They're beholden to their shareholders and maximizing their profits, despite so without even having to look at societal implications, including death of a human. That's a social outcome. Anyway, just one second here. I just gotta find the video because it was a really good one that sums it up. That's it. Okay. Bear with me. There we go.
Shift for the United States. And
Your country's in big trouble.
Can I
Wait a
answer?
minute. No.
Can
You've
I
done a lot
answer?
of talking.
Trump just changed everything, and I mean everything. We're talking about a full reset, our relationship with Europe, our stance on free speech, our focus here in the United States. This isn't just about the fireworks in the Oval Office between President Trump and Ukrainian dictator Zelensky on Friday. No. This is a major shift for the United States. And yet, of course, most people are only focused on the drama, and they're missing the much bigger picture here. So let me tell you what's really happening. Trump is saying enough. Enough with Europe treating America like a piggy bank. Enough with Ukraine pretending that this war can be won with an endless supply of American cash. Enough with the United States footing the bill while Europeans work 35-hour work weeks and expect us to carry the burden for them. Journalist Michael Schellenberger just laid it out exactly what's going on here. I love this. Watch.
There's something I need to say, and I need to be blunt. So let me start by saying I love Europe. You Europeans do not respect Americans. You can protest and say, no, we love America. No, you don't. We know you look down on us. You think you're better than us. And in some ways you are. You know, you work 35 hours a week. It's this thing where Ukraine comes to the White House and acts like it can tell us what we should do. That's not what the relationship is. This thing where somehow we're on the hook, including for countries that are not in NATO, that was never the deal. Ukraine is not part of NATO. We were never obligated to protect Ukraine. People on the left, on the right, they do not want to be in a nuclear war with Russia. How can we explain this to you? But the behavior that we're seeing coming out of European leaders and out of Zelensky just now in the Oval Office suggests that the relationship is over.
Boom. He's right. That's the reality. This is about realigning America's priorities. No more free rides. And Zelensky, he just found out the hard way. Unless Europe wants to foot the bill, Zelensky flew in on Saturday to London to beg for more weapons and money from Keir Starmer. And the United Kingdom appears to be going along with it, saying, yeah, the world and the United Kingdom stands with Zelensky. And amazingly, they just announced that Britain has signed a 100-year agreement to support Ukraine militarily and financially. Great. This includes providing Ukraine $3 billion a year until the year 2031. and to support them as long as they need? You see what's happening here. A global reset. The U.S. is done with him. It's over. Europe can have him. Take this little cocaine-sniffing troll, Europe. You can have him. Europe can go into World War III by continuing this war. So just for context here, Zelensky flies into Washington, D.C., expecting another blank check. He's used to sort of the weekend at Bernie's President Biden writing blank checks. Instead, he walks into the Oval Office, sits down with Trump, and then within a few minutes, things go off the rails when he tries to play tough with Trump in front of the media. Trump's not having it. Trump lays out a deal, a minerals deal that could have ended this war, secured Ukraine's future, and actually benefited America. And what does Zelensky do? He flips out, tries to tell us that America hasn't done enough diplomacy. Where have you guys been? How do you think that sat with him? How do you think that sat with Trump and J.D. Vance? That America needs to do more? Well, that led Trump and J.D. Vance to basically flip out on this cocaine-sniffing dictator.
Your country is in big trouble.
Can I
Wait a
answer?
minute. No. You've done a lot of talking. Your country is in big trouble.
I know.
You're not winning. You're not winning this. You have a damn good chance of coming out okay because of us.
Mr. President.
But the truth is, Zelensky wasn't interested in peace. He wasn't interested in rebuilding Ukraine. He wanted more money and more weapons, more war. And worst of all, someone in the deep state told him to play tough with Trump. See, that's the real story here. Who told Zelensky to tank this deal? Who told Zelensky to take this hard line?
And Zelensky called J.D. Vance a bitch in Ukraine. It's actually a bitch in Russian as well, but it was recorded.
Stance. Because make no mistake about it, he was given marching orders from somebody. And now reports indicate those figures from the previous Obama-Biden administration were to blame, including Susan Rice and the demon herself, Victoria Nuland, advised Zelensky to reject Trump's deal. Can you believe this? This kind of back channel interference could potentially violate the Logan Act. So what's the Logan Act, you might be asking? Well, it was enacted back in 1799, and it prohibits unauthorized American citizens from negotiating with foreign governments. The goal is to prevent private individuals from undermining U.S. foreign policy. So if officials like Rice and Nuland advise Zelensky without authorization, they could be in some serious legal jeopardy and go to prison for the rest of their lives.
Obviously, it's a very, very sad day and an embarrassment for the United States on the world stage. It was a play to his base, but above all, it was a play to Vladimir Putin. To show fealty to Vladimir Putin.
I mean, listen to her, the hubris. Who are you to tell Trump how to handle these negotiations? But we can even show you the moment Zelensky received a message during this meeting with Trump. Around the 34-minute mark, something interesting happens. You can see him being handed a message, a reminder from the Obama team to play tough with Trump. Don't take this deal. You can watch closely as this happens. Zelensky somehow still thinks he can win this war by retaking Crimea, pushing Russia back, magically making Ukraine whole again. That's a fantasy. It's not happening.
Don't tell us what we're going to feel. We're trying to solve a problem. Don't tell us what we're going to feel.
I'm not telling you.
Because you're in no position to dictate that.
That's
Remember
exactly
this. You're in no position to dictate what we're going to feel. We're going to feel very good.
Feel influence.
We're going to feel very good and very strong.
You will feel influence.
You're right now not in a very good position. You've allowed yourself to be in a very bad position, and he happens to be right about it.
From the very beginning of the war.
You're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having cards. Right now, you don't. You're playing cards. You're playing cards. You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III. You're gambling with World War III.
I mean, that's the truth. One that Zelensky refuses to hear. He's pushing a dead-end strategy that only guarantees more Ukrainians die. But here's the bigger picture. The real minerals deal isn't even in parts of Ukraine that Zelensky controls anymore. The areas Trump was trying to make a deal on. Not the prime regions, not the good regions. The real prize has always been in what was once Eastern Ukraine, but is now Russia. I'm talking about the Donbas region, Donetsk, Luhansk. This is where the richest mineral deposits are. And guess what? That land now belongs to Russia. It's part of the Russian Federation. Zelensky shot himself in the foot by rejecting Trump's minerals deal. Even it wasn't a great deal because it's not really that great of minerals in those areas. Because the real leverage wasn't even in his hands anymore anyway. Let's to a great book called Borderland, A Journey Through the History of Ukraine. And here's a key quote in this book. Quote, Ukrainian politicians' worst nightmare is the Donbas separatism, the fear that one day Eastern Ukraine will want autonomy or even bid to rejoin Russia. Yes, go back to being part of Russia. And they did overwhelmingly. That ship has sailed. Since 2014, Ukraine has carried out a genocide against those people, those ethnic Russians living in that region. And 2 years ago, those regions voted overwhelmingly, over 90% vote to join Russia. And with them, they took the minerals. Sorry, Zelensky. So what happens next? The real minerals deal is going to happen, not with Ukraine. It's going to happen now between the United States and Russia, because reports indicate that Putin has already agreed to a deal that would allow the United States companies to access minerals rich in that region, in Donetsk, in Luhansk. Because at the end of the day, Russia has the resources and America needs them. Ukraine really does not. And while everyone was distracted by the theatrics on Friday, Trump was playing a much bigger game here, because this entire debacle wasn't just about Ukraine. It was about America's economic independence. It was about a massive shift that's happening right now. The old world order breaking down. Trump is making it clear America comes first. And Europe, if you don't like it, sorry. If you want World War III, because you're going to keep pushing this war in Ukraine, so be it. We're out. We're done. So that's the news update part of today's video. Now I want to tell you about today's sponsor, which is tied directly to President Trump's minerals declaration that he just made on Truth Social last week. Did you see this? Because this is an America First declaration by a long shot, that he wants to bring copper mining back home to America. Quoting him now, listen. Like our steel and aluminum industries, our great American copper industry has been decimated by global actors attacking our domestic production. To build back our copper industry, I've requested my Secretary of Commerce and the USTR to study the copper imports and end unfair trade practices putting Americans out of work. Tariffs will help build back our American copper industry and strengthen our national defense. American industries depend on copper, and it should be made in America. No exceptions, he says. No exceptions. America First creates American jobs and protects our national security. It's time for copper to come home. Hallelujah. Trump made it clear that he's putting America first. His stated energy goal is to drill, baby, drill, unlocking America's vast riches. And he's already slapped tariffs on aluminum and steel, promised copper is coming next, guys. And this is from the USGS, the Mineral Commodity Summaries of 2025. It says copper is a critical mineral due to its essential applications in energy infrastructure and defense, with U.S. production of 1.2 million tons offset by significant imports, highlighting the supply chain risks. So instead, basically what he's saying, instead of America drilling for copper, we've been relying on all these imports. He's basically saying this ends now. On February 14th, Executive Order 14213 was issued by the Trump administration's National Energy Dominance Council. This directive implicitly prioritizes copper as a critical resource because of its pivotal role in national energy security and economic strategy.
Copper is a critical material, and the supply of copper is vital to our national.
Yeah, so copper. He's talking about mine, baby, mine copper, which is also, I think, a good thing. And he's saying that it should be explicitly on American soil. He said explicitly, I think twice or something along those lines. And Jimmy Dore also had a good breakdown as well. Again, this is stuff that I've been sharing, like even on posts on LinkedIn and stuff like that for years, but I really like sharing it when like the more mainstream people pick it up.
First term. Or splitting with their European allies in the UN votes. In a dramatic shift in transatlantic relations under President Donald Trump, the United States split with its European allies by refusing to blame Russia for its invasion of Ukraine in votes on 3 UN resolutions Monday seeking an end to the 3-year war. The growing divide follows Trump's decision to open direct negotiations with Russia on ending the war, dismaying Ukraine and its European supporters by excluding them from the preliminary talks last week. In a UN General Assembly, the U.S. joined Russia in voting against a European-backed Ukrainian resolution that calls out Moscow's aggression and demands an immediate withdrawal of Russian troops. The U.S. then abstained from voting on its own competing resolution after Europeans, led by France, succeeded in amending it to make clear Russia was the aggressor. The voting was taking place on the 3rd anniversary of Russia's invasion, and as Trump was hosting French President Emmanuel Macron in Washington, and his wife or father. Who knows? Who knows who that is? Really, I don't know who that is. But I get that's an amazing thing. I mean, what a shift in administrations from Biden administration to the Trump administration. And what do you make of Europe still trying to prolong this? What is in it for Europe to try to still make enemies with Russia? Wouldn't it be better for Europe all the way around if they fixed the Nord Stream pipeline and made friends with Russia? Wouldn't it? I don't get it.
You are absolutely right. You're applying logic to what Europe should do. European leaders, not European people. People, the public in Europe is becoming increasingly disenchanted with this whole thing. But European leaders are deeply committed to the war. And the reason they're deeply committed to the war
and not
is
just
because
European,
they
Canadian. I know people that are high-ranking generals, colonels, full colonels, even that are working under the umbrella of the UN and NATO. But again, they're pushing propaganda on social media, even on LinkedIn, and I've shared it before to call it out. And so of course they're the ones that, like, this is their part of their job, their position, and so they should be in different positions. They shouldn't be there in that capacity, and they shouldn't be lying to people. And people are giving them credence and credibility because they're like, oh well, they're on the ground, they would know. Well, they don't.
Associated with the United States presence in Europe. They want to preserve the US presence in Europe. They want to preserve NATO. They want to preserve all the structures that originate and have been created around NATO. Because, of course, if those go, then, of course, they have no place because other political forces will then step in and replace them. So that is why the European leaders are taking this extraordinary stance of basically attaching themselves to Zelensky, who's, not waving but drowning, as that poem says. They're attaching themselves. They're pulling themselves down. They're creating a deep and deepening crisis in Europe, but they don't seem to be able to change direction or change course.
It seems like a suicide mission for Europe, right, Alex?
Yeah, it is. But, for the European people, for the European elite, like Alexander says, for them, the most important thing is to keep the United States in Europe. Yep. It's not even so much about the Ukraine war anymore for the European elite, the globalist political class. For them, the Ukraine war is the mechanism that keeps the United States invested in Europe. It keeps NATO funded, keeps NATO going, it keeps the weapons moving. It keeps the United States bogged down and investing and sending money to Europe, which is effectively the money that goes to all of the European institutions and all of the European elite. So that's why Ukraine is so important for them, because if Ukraine goes, then they see it as America goes, and if America goes, well, then there goes all of the money and all of the power as well, because countries like Estonia, like Latvia, even like the UK. They love to go around the world and to bully other countries and say, you better do as we tell you to do, not because we're this big, powerful country, but because we got the United States in back of us. And if you don't do what we tell you to do, well, then the United States is going to come along and they're going to sanction you or they're going to punish you. So it's the money, it's the power. They don't want to see that go. And the mechanism to keep the United States invested is Ukraine.
So, so when they blew up the Nord Stream pipeline, correct me if I'm wrong. That isn't Germany, which is the economic engine of Europe. Aren't they paying like 2 or 3 or 4 times as much for energy now as they were before that? And hasn't that had a ripple effect across every economy in Europe?
Absolutely. The whole of the European Union is in deep crisis. Germany has had 3 years of economic contraction. Nobody calls it recession, by the way, even though that is what it is. But we avoid calling it a recession. We just call it now an economic contraction. So that's now the new language that's being used. But everywhere, right across Europe, you have economic recession, you have stagnation, you have falling wages, you have growing problems. And that's why you see all these political movements, some of which I have sympathies for, some of which I don't, by the way, coming up to the fore, because they're at least trying, or at least expressing, some of the frustrations that the European public has with the European elite, which, exactly as Alex said, is completely tied up with the whole concept of the West, which makes them feel important, which gives them status in the world, which gives them status in their own countries, and which ultimately, it's important to remember, is the world they know. I mean, they've lived inside it. It's very frightening, very disturbing for them that it might change. So that's the reality. Nord Stream, far less important, much more important. Keep the Americans in, keep them committed to Ukraine. And if, somebody blew up Nord Stream, well, don't talk about it very much. Engage in investigations which go nowhere. Talk about the Russians all the time. Say it was the Russians who switched off the gas supply, which European leaders are doing, by the way, all the time. Olaf Scholz is doing it. Ursula von der Leyen is doing it.
Yeah.
Keir Starmer in Britain has recently taken to doing it. So talk in that way rather than face realities, or really face the problems of the people of Europe.
So so now we just showed you that Trump's UN ambassador would refuse to vote with Europe to say that Russia was at fault for the invasion of Ukraine in 3 different votes, 3 different ways. But here's the thing that seems a little puzzling to me. Trump extends Russia sanctions ahead of meeting with Zelensky. I mean, in the early 1960s, this would have been called diplomacy, but in these dumbed down reactionary times, they refer to it now as playing both sides, because, you can't sell weapons unless you have a side. Is that about him wanting to just put money in the pocket of the military industrial complex as he winds down the war?
Well, I think probably one of the reason that he would have given, if you asked him for why he did it, is because he didn't want to lift the sanctions just before Zelensky came, because that might have appeared as if he really was tilting towards Russia. And of course, if you've listened to what he said in all his exchanges with Zelensky, he's trying to insist that he's taking a sort of middle position. But ultimately, again, you're absolutely right. He wants normalization of relations with Russia. It makes absolutely no sense looking at that you keep the sanctions. It disincentivizes the Russians to seek normalization with the Americans, because the Americans are still sanctioning them. But logic and reason has been thrown out of the window for such a long time now that perhaps one shouldn't expect it just to come back at all quickly. At least we should be grateful that the Americans and the Russians are talking, and not to worry perhaps about things like sanctions, which the Russians themselves now understand are not going to be lifted anytime soon.
Yeah. And that's another thing. Trump is still saying that there's going to be sanctions on Russia. So he's not like a pro-friggin' Putin propagandist or whatever you want to call it, or supporter. Like people are saying he is. Just the level of...
Well,
it's wild.
Let you know exactly what is happening. U.S. President Trump signed a decree extending some of anti-Russia sanctions
There you go.
until March 6, 2026, ahead of his meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. The decree, which is set to be published in the U.S. Federal Register on Friday, extends the 10-year-old state of emergency over the situation in Ukraine. The sanctions were first declared on March 6, 2014, under Barack Obama in response to the Black Sea Peninsula of Crimea joining Russia. The decree also extends related sanctions imposed by Obama. Trump was about to meet the Ukrainian leader, for whom he said has a lot of respect after recently calling him a dictator. He has said his Friday's meeting with the Ukrainian president has in store a potential $1 trillion deal, offering the U.S. easy access to a bonanza of rare earth minerals. will be digging, Trump told reporters on the eve of Zelensky's visit. The American taxpayers will now effectively be reimbursed for the money and hundreds of billions of dollars poured into helping Ukraine defend itself. So, we're the masters. The United States are the masters of traumatizing an area to the point where they would give you anything to make it stop. Sort of like a Guantanamo torture tactic. That's kind of what is happening here. This is at odds with the widespread assessment of current and former U.S. officials who say there's little actual evidence of great rare earth and other mineral wealth in Ukraine. They say much of what does exist will be difficult, even impossible to exploit in the eastern war-torn part of the country. On February 12th, Trump said negotiations to end the Ukraine war will start immediately after holding a lengthy and high productive call with Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin. And here, Michael Tracy tweets out, Trump suggests he's going to get the Black Sea coastline back for Ukraine. Presumably, this would require Putin agreeing to relinquish territory that he's declared an eternal part of the Russian Federation. Let's listen.
Mr. President, are there areas specifically of Ukraine that you're talking about in giving back, specifically Crimea? Have you gotten to those details yet on such an agreement?
Well, you mean the areas that were taken?
Yeah.
There are a lot of areas that were taken. Yeah, we've talked about it. A lot of the sea line has been taken. And we'll be talking about that, and we're going to see if we can get it back or get a lot of it back for Ukraine, if that's possible. We'll be seeing about that. Okay? Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Press.
Thank you very much.
So, what do you think? Do you think he's going to be able to get back that territory? What is the plan there, you think? Alex?
No, he's not going to be able to get back that territory. I think Russia's been very clear that not only, at least in the terms that they've outlined in June of this year, Putin outlined these terms, that it's not only about the territory that they currently hold, but they consider the entirety of the region, Zaporozhye and Kherson, Lugansk and Donetsk, as part of the Russian Federation. That means that any Ukrainian presence that is currently in those regions would have to leave in order to get to a point where Russia's ready to negotiate. So that's Russia's opening bid. That's their minimum for negotiations and for terms. So Trump is not going to be. I mean, I don't see any way that he's going to be able to get the territory back, especially on the Black Sea. I mean, the whole rare earth minerals deal. We've been talking about this in a few videos that we've made, me and Alexander, and then the whole thing seems like smoke and mirrors. I mean, there's no $1 trillion rare earth minerals in Ukraine. Most of the minerals are in the Russian part anyway. About 50%, maybe up to 70% of the rare earth minerals are in the Russian part of what they hold right now currently. So, this whole $1 trillion in minerals doesn't exist. There is oil and gas in this deal, Jimmy. So the deal, which is about a 2-page memorandum of understanding. I don't even think you can call it a contract or a deal. It's pretty much written on a napkin paper. I mean, that's how flimsy this agreement is. And it basically it's Zelensky giving 50% of his country's resources in perpetuity to the United States. But there's nothing really holding this deal together. The money goes in some fund. The United States gets access to oil and gas and ports and minerals and whatever. And that was this big deal that was going to be signed today. And that's what Trump is talking about as he's sitting there with Keir Starmer yesterday. And he's talking about getting this contract and perhaps having some leverage over Russia as they go into negotiations. That's what I think this is all about.
And this is on top of Ukraine selling off half of its farmland to BlackRock, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they're balkanizing.
It's selling of their country. It's the selling of their country. And the deal is, I mean, Alexander, he knows these things better than I do, but I've seen a lot of MOUs and a lot of memorandums of understanding and term papers, term sheets. I mean, this deal is not even that. It's 2 pages of nothing.
And go ahead, Alexander.
No, it describes it exactly. I mean, I have seen deals about minerals extractions and things of that. This isn't even a point of agreement. I mean, it's something that somebody wrote out very quickly without really exploring the details. They're not even a list of assets. that are going to be extracted or developed or anything of that kind. I think this thing began to acquire, at some level, a kind of symbolic importance. I think Zelensky came along, talked about he's got all of these minerals, which he doesn't really have, to the Americans months ago, saying, you know, you give me weapons, go on giving me weapons, and I will give you all of these minerals. And somehow or other, through some strange process, we got into a situation where the Americans began to take that seriously and started to demand these mineral rights and all of these other rights. And the thing got its own momentum somehow, and it turned into a kind of test of wills between the Trump people and Zelensky, that, you know, you've got to sign this thing and you must sign this thing. If you don't sign this thing, this will be very, very angry with you. So they've now come up with a warm of words, which is actually completely meaningless because there really isn't anything to trade.
Well, just to put a button on this, Clandestine tweets out, there's a lot to unpack from Zelensky's debacle at the White House today, but my initial takeaway is that Trump just got the optics he needed to go scorched earth on Zelensky. Trump might not help Ukraine at all now, and Russia's end of the deal probably just got sweeter. Now Trump could be more lenient with Russia in negotiations, and Zelensky has solidified himself as an irrelevant speed bump on the journey to peace. Zelensky just lost his most valuable asset, which was Trump's diplomacy. Now Trump might not give Ukraine anything. It looks bad for Ukraine. Like, how much are the Ukraine people going to regret that they didn't sign that peace deal in March of 2022? I mean, that was the time, and they had it already worked out and agreed to. And then Zelensky just folded like a house of cards when Boris Johnson went there and said, don't sign the peace deal. Now, I'm sure he was getting threats from the Nazis in his own country to not do that. But, I mean, that was the best. I mean, it's unbelievably sad, actually, to see what happened to the Ukrainian people and to Ukraine because someone like Zelensky just went along with the West, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the April 2022 deal was a very good deal for Ukraine.
It was.
The person who negotiated it on Zelensky's behalf has said so.
Yeah.
The Russians made surprising concessions at the time. And I think the move...
And people are saying that Russia was the one that was instigating the war during this time too. I'm going to share my post, like I shared today. I could show the ones like from previous posts over the years as well. Again, it's very intimidating to respond to people on LinkedIn that have huge friggin' acronyms like in their title and are in key positions around the world, and they're sharing information that's incorrect, and so respectfully trying to give it a differing opinion because it's important and not being taken seriously. So this was my post. NATO, corporations, and Zelensky corruption is finally getting exposed. The fraud, money laundering, kickbacks, selling half the provided weapons on the black market to be used against us in future events, like always, and more. I'm going to edit that. General Fraser, General Eyre, General Carignan, I hope you get investigated for crimes against humanity. And again, I don't like saying that, but like this is just to show like the severity and the level of importance that they held, right? They were in key positions of leadership, representing the Canadian Armed Forces at the highest levels, at home and abroad, and they failed us. And not only us, and not only did Canadians die, even Joseph Hildebrand, for example, former Patricia, once a Patricia, always a Patricia, but he was a veteran, and someone that went to Ukraine, I already talked about that, and died, and no one cared, right? And so GoFundMe through the family was created, and people like myself trying to assist in getting his body back to Canada. And then again, how many Ukrainians have died? Anyway, so I'm not saying like jail for life or anything like that, but I'm saying like they should be held accountable. They've been of service to Canada and Canadians for many years. Unfortunately, they've been on the wrong side of history in their terms, and so there needs to be some kind of, again, accountability. They need to be fired. they need to be dishonorably discharged. And I know this sounds extreme and severe, but again, people's lives have been lost. You guys are forgetting the amount of casualties that have been incurred and injuries since the start of this war, at least hundreds of thousands. And if you count both sides, it's like almost 2 million people that have been wounded, killed, injured, etc. And so every one of those lives matter. Every single one of those lives matter. And especially, and not to put more importance on human lives, but like civilians, innocent civilians caught in the crossfires. Again, this is only supporting and enabling people at the top, these elitist types that are the only ones profiting off of this, whether it be through prestige and power and the title and like the travel and the feeling of important and all the money they're getting. Because again, this is 6 figures and then the kickbacks, right? And they're not even on the front lines, and just all that could have been avoided, right? Yeah. This could have been resolved diplomatically in January 2022. And then even again in January, February, and in March, and in April, and in May. Anyways, this was not a surprise, Mr. Fraser. It was on my whiteboard, and I also posted on 14 February 2022, 10 days beforehand. So I'm letting people know, because they keep on saying, oh, this was a shock. We can't believe that this, happened. And, but you should have known, right? The same day the Emergency Act was unconstitutionally declared in Ottawa, that I was also right about. How did I know? And they were again on the wrong side of that. Like Can 4 gens created, mandates created, people getting kicked out, all of this stuff, dishonorably discharged. And even on that day, like I had even emailed Pierre Poilievre. I've shared that email, and I'm saying like, it's like, please don't vote on declaring this Emergency Act. Like, this is I didn't say unconstitutional, but I said it's like not in the best interest of Canadians at all. I'm like, people don't understand what's actually going on. And I was talking about the crisis actors and the stage and plan events and like where a lot of the funding comes from and the different instigators and all that stuff. And yeah, so it was just an interesting time. And people were joking about employing tanks on innocent civilians and actually people even in government that were working in the crowds as well, heroes, and the non-hero types, which was a smaller percentage, was still impactful. So anyway, and they were wrong about this as well. And yeah, there are plenty of Canadian generals that also do not have a clue about what actually happened in Canada, what was actually going on in Canada either. COVID ring a bell? How about many other events like 9/11, January 6th, the Freedom Convoy? Didn't you call people who attended the convoy right-wing extremists, amongst other things? Despite you claiming that being there makes you the subject matter expert, it doesn't. It makes you a very expensive placeholder puppet. I also worked with the companies going to assist in medevacs, but because I was unvaccinated, I was not able to go. I asked repeatedly. I was tracking everything. However, while you failed us, J.D. Vance called Zelensky out for his dog and pony shows when people visit Ukraine, a show and propaganda that you fell for. You were there lying to yourself and everyone else, trying to play the hero. NATO and their lobbyist friends and family with shares and stocks in companies, in war companies like Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, lied to you and you fell for it. And even Marco Mendicino, his wife, had shares and stocks in Northrop Grumman during the time that he was the public safety officer and working within as a member of parliament. So again, that's a conflict of interest. Like they're voting for funding going to Ukraine that's not going to Ukraine. It's going to the shareholders. It's going to the people that are the heads of these companies that are making like the multi-million-dollar salaries, whatever you want to call it. Anyways, I'm gonna edit this out because it's a little bit negative, and I don't want to make this about like, oh, I told you so. I want this to be like a lot of people did, and the people like them were the ones that were supporting and enabling this. And you can't say like, oh, this is like what if you pushed someone over a cliff, right? Like, how are you going to say they died if you're the one that actually are the ones that are pushing them over, right? Or into a shark tank or into a crocodile, layer, whatever you want to call it. And then they end up dying by the crocodile. You're like, yes, ultimately the crocodile or the shark may be what killed these people. But you're the one that pushed them in, right? You're the one that pushed them in and maybe even closed the cage and locked people in. Anyway. Now there are over 1 million deaths and injuries sustained collectively in a country that may never recover in our lifetimes, or World War III, which is still on the table, which is terrifying because this would be nuclear. Maybe, just maybe, you should start doing your own research and critical analysis of events before calling people with different opinions radical for telling you the truth, when our Canadian government and the Ukrainian government are clearly not. Now today, experts are saying that Trump is exploiting Zelensky for precious minerals, but guess where 50 to 70% of precious minerals are? On Russian soil currently. With Trump, on Russian soil currently. BlackRock now owns 50% of Ukrainian farmland. His meeting after his failed meeting with Trump, wear a suit, was with and the military, pharmaceutical, industrial tech elitists who are the only ones benefiting. This was not a war we should have enabled or supported. Sorry, my partner came in the office for a second. And so I just wanted to see if you wanted me for anything. This was not a war we should have enabled or supported because Ukrainians are the ones who suffered, and so did Canadians ultimately, especially within our defense. Within our military, the numbers are terrible, and there's no retention. People are not trying to enroll, and people that are in, there's even people that even over the summer they were sleeping in vehicles because they couldn't afford their mortgages or their rents because of how crazy the economy is right now. Yeah, so this was not a war we should have enabled or supported because Ukrainians are the ones who suffered, and so did Canadians, like I said. Trump has not lifted sanctions on Russia and is trying to get land back to Ukraine as well. So people are saying that Trump is, trying to exploit Ukraine. Like he's trying to help even after that disastrous meeting with Zelensky. He was still saying, no, we're not lifting sanctions on Russia. We're trying to get land back. Like he's going to try to get this back, but is it going to work? I don't know. This wasn't his war to fix, and he was saying they wouldn't have even been involved enough in the war to begin with had he been in power. So again, there are a lot of concerns with Trump, but again, there's a lot of things that he's doing that is necessary and important, and we shouldn't be dismissing that or calling him some kind of an extremist or like an Adolf Hitler type. Like this is all just silliness. And yeah. Anyways, I'll bite my tongue on saying anything more about that, but I will talk about the Epstein files a little bit. I don't know if this will get released, like I was saying in my other videos, just because of the level of involvement at the highest levels of government and who and which countries they're from or have dual citizenship with, and just how much power and influence these organizations have within the media, within the education systems, within the banking systems, within like the military, pharmaceutical, industrial tech complex, and even in the and so I don't know. So Ian Carroll was on the Twins pod. These guys are freaking amazing. I would love to go on their show, and he was talking about all that stuff. And anyway, I'm going to edit my LinkedIn post because it just seems a little bit. I was right. I friggin' hate that because again, it's not about that. And I just want to get involved in like these discussions, like these tabletop operations and strategic talks and stuff like that, and just be like, have you considered this? Have you looked at this? Look at this. And because again, it's only going to help, right? So anyways, on that note, I will leave it at that, and I hope that everyone has a wonderful rest of your day.